Thanks again, guys, for joining us today. You are welcome to turn your cameras on if you like. It does sometimes help our presenters to have faces where they can see what we're thinking or how we're reacting to the programs. So do feel free to turn those cameras on if you're interested. We will be getting started in just a few minutes. Hi, I'm Jenny from the Des Moines Library. Haven't said that yet. We'll say it several more times. So we'll just kind of give it a few more minutes for people to trek their way in.
And I'll give a disclaimer up front. I keep looking out my window over my left shoulder because the sky has turned black in Norwalk. The wind has gone crazy, and we are getting some nice little hail here. So hopefully we do not have any internet connection issues as the storm blows through. Grateful for the rain, but its timing is a little undesirable. So hopefully nobody notices but me as I keep looking out my window going, wow, that's a big change in the last 3 minutes.
I am slightly concerned that we will all lose power. We'll find out how this goes. Excellent. Well, we'll give it just one more minute for people to make their way in, guys. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's going to be an exciting program. Oh yeah, severe thunderstorm warning. Well, I feel like that is vaguely obvious at the time. So again, please feel free to turn your cameras on if you are so inclined. It is nice to see each other's faces. Your microphones are off at this point just because background noise, especially with the rain in the background, we will all end up hearing each other. So your mics are off for now, but we will have them. Oh, Steve says the storm's already blown through West Des Moines. Excellent. Maybe it will be a fast one then. So feel free, cameras on if you like. Mics will turn on once we're ready for some question and answer, but you are welcome to type anything into the chat. We'll be watching, keeping an eye out and seeing if anything needs to be read out loud. My name is Jenny. I'm from the Des Moines Public Library. Thank you guys so much today for joining us for our program with the Fort Des Moines Museum. I think we're hitting right about 6 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started any second, just so that we respect everybody's time. We may have a few latecomers making their way in. So most of you are aware of what the program is about. So in May of 1917, the United States opened its very first officer training camp for Black men in military history, and the location was Fort Des Moines. Over the next 6 months, 1,200 Black men are trained to lead segregated commands in World War I, all the while knowing that the success or failure as leaders was going to be used as evidence of the abilities of their race. So today we're going to learn about the experiences of those men and closely examine the story of one man, perhaps the most famous graduate of Fort Des Moines, Charles Hamilton Houston. So we'll see how these men shaped not only US military history, but the civil rights movement as a whole. So I'm very excited. Today we have as our presenter, Jeff Cleaver. Jeff, take it away, and thanks for joining us.
All right, well, thank you very much for having me and for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today about the Fort Des Moines Museum and Education Center. My name is Jeff Cleaver. I'm a board member at the Fort Des Moines Museum. And have been for, I think, 3 years now. For those of you who are not familiar with Fort Des Moines, I will give you more history on the museum and its complex and operating hours when we get to the end. But I'll give you a little background on myself as well. I joined the board of the Fort Des Moines Museum because I am a history dork at heart. My previous job prior to moving back to Iowa was as the education supervisor at a Civil War battlefield and plantation in Virginia. Prior to that, I was the executive director of a history museum in Kansas. And so when I moved back to Iowa, joining the board was one of the few ways I had available to sort of scratch the history itch. And it has been a real learning experience for me. I grew up on the south side of Des Moines, drove by the fort every day, that I was working at the Target at Southbridge Mall, and knew absolutely nothing about the history that took place there. And I think that's true for the vast majority of people who live in or are from Des Moines. Most people aren't familiar with the history of the fort and the stories that took place there. So that's really the mission. That's really what we try and do at the Fort Des Moines Museum, is share these stories so that people understand about the significant role that Des Moines played in military history, in civil rights history, And not just once, but twice. We're going to focus on half of the story tonight. There's a whole other half of the story where the first officer training camp for women in United States military history as well. So it's really a significant place that deserves its recognition and deserves to be remembered. I want to start tonight by talking a little bit about the general history of the fort. The Fort Des Moines that everybody knows on the south side off Army Post Road, that's actually the third Fort Des Moines that has ever existed. The first Fort Des Moines was built over on the Mississippi River back in the 1840s, and it was part of the string of forts that the federal government built not to protect the settlers from the Native Americans, but to protect the Native Americans from the settlers. Those forts were designed to keep the settlers off of Native American land. We know that that didn't work particularly well. The settlers came across anyway. And so a second line of forts was built later into the 1850s. And so the second Fort Des Moines moves from the Mississippi River to what is now Des Moines. There is no city of Des Moines when they built the fort. In fact, Des Moines' first name was Fort Des Moines. It was the only thing that was here at the time. And they built it at the confluence of the Raccoon and Des Moines rivers, an obvious point to build a fort because that's where transportation can come through and so on and so forth. Today, it would be about where the new Science Museum is in downtown Des Moines. The rivers have shifted course over time. The Army Corps of Engineers has pushed them further to the east. But it would be about in that general vicinity as the second Fort Des Moines. The third Fort Des Moines is the Fort Des Moines where our story takes place, the one on the south side. It is started construction in 1901 and is opened and operating by 1903. And they move it to the south side of Des Moines because when they opened in 1903, it is a cavalry base. It is designed to train men on horseback to fight in the cavalry. And so they don't want to be in downtown Des Moines. They want to be on the south side where there's a lot of space. In fact, there's not really a south side of Des Moines at that point in time. So they move it down out of the city limits so that they've got a ton of space to roam around, a ton of space to do their maneuvers and their drills and so forth. And so from 1903 until 1917, it operates as this cavalry base. But in 1917, we have our first major historical episode, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight, that first major moment in Fort Des Moines history. And that moment comes about because of World War I. So World War I, of course, begins long before, or years before, I should say, the United States gets involved. With the European countries fighting against each other. The United States stays out of it for several years, but in that time, there's a debate happening domestically, and that debate is whether or not we're going to allow, for the first time ever, Black men to be commissioned officers in the United States Army. Now, obviously, the Black men had fought in the military for years. They even before we were a country, they were fighting. The Revolutionary War, we have some examples. We certainly have many examples in the Civil War. 180,000 African American men fight in the Union Army during the Civil War after the Emancipation Proclamation. The term Buffalo Soldiers, that is put on Black regiments by the Native Americans during those frontier wars. In part because the Native Americans respected those units as fighters, and in part because they thought that the Black men's woolly hair reminded them of the woolly hair of buffalo, hence the name Buffalo Soldiers. And you will see that term carried through segregated Black regiments until the Army is desegregated in the 1950s. So they have a long history of service, but they're not allowed to be commissioned officers. And so this is the story we're going to tell, the story of how these men, and specifically one man, Charles Hamilton Houston, gets involved in this endeavor, what his training is like at Fort Des Moines, and then what the legacy of that training is, and the legacy of all of those men long after the guns have fallen silent during the war. Now, as I said, this part of our history is largely forgotten in Des Moines. And it's not just the Fort Des Moines story. I think World War I is sort of relegated to second tier status in our historical memory in the United States. it was supposed to be the war to end all wars. We have over 70 million military personnel mobilized worldwide. That's a huge percentage of the population, 70 million men mobilized across Europe, the United States, and other continents. 16 million people perished during World War I, 9 million combatants and 7 million civilians. That is an astronomically large number. And then you can add even millions of more deaths with the 1918 flu epidemic. That is in part, the war is sort of a catalyst for it. You've got all these men in trenches, and then they all go back to all the corners of the world carrying a flu virus with them that causes between, and we don't actually really know, this is a pretty big estimate, between 50 and 100 million more deaths. The treaty that they signed, the armistice that they signed, has direct links to the causes of World War II. And so it's this huge historical moment for the world, but in the United States, it's sort of relegated, and I think for several reasons. The primary reason is that despite its huge impact on the world, it doesn't have nearly the impact it does on us. Obviously, none of the fighting takes place on any of our soil, so that makes a huge difference. We only mobilize 4 million men, so there are 70 million total, only 4 million are coming from the United States. That's still a large number, but remember, we don't get involved until essentially the last year of fighting. So we are not there for some of those early mobilizations. There's only about 110,000 American deaths. Now that's still a large number, but when you compare it to the American Civil War, where the estimates are over 700,000 American deaths, it's not as big. And again, only 45,000 from the 1918 flu outbreak. So because it doesn't have such a huge impact on us, we sort of don't give it the same level of memory in our story. But it is worth remembering, it is worth knowing, it is worth understanding what is happening here, not just globally, but specifically at Fort Des Moines. So our story really begins, and I'm going to begin our story in May of 1917. Spring of 1917, when this young man right here, this is the photograph of Charles Hamilton Houston, steps off the train in downtown Des Moines, steps onto the train depot, and catches a ride out to Fort Des Moines. And Charles is here to be part of an experiment. This experiment to have, for the first time, commissioned Black officers in the United States military history. Now, Charles is the grandson of slaves. So this is sort of the timeline. We sometimes forget 1917 is not very far removed from his grandparents being enslaved, but his parents get him into what is called the M Street High School. It's a school in Washington, D.C. It's the first Black high school in the United States, and so he is going to be a very well-educated man. Now, when he starts school, he's not remembered that way. His teachers commented on his persistently annoying conduct and his nonchalant attitude, is the way that they put it. But as he matured, as all kids do, his academic aptitude sort of really comes to the forefront. And by the time he graduates from high school, he's earned a partial scholarship to Amherst. And by the time he graduates from Amherst, he graduates as one of the 6 valedictorians of Amherst College. So now at 21, college-educated man, he decides that he is going to be a part of this experiment. He doesn't have to be. He's got a degree. He certainly doesn't need to go risk his life. He's not in danger of being drafted, probably. The likelihood is pretty low. But he wants to be here as part of this experiment. Now, the experiment, the sort of origins of it are really, really interesting. We've known for years that World War I is happening, and the debate is happening in the United States about when we enter, if we enter. Should this be the time when we ask these Black men to be commissioned officers? And men like W.B. Du Bois are advocating for this, they're lobbying for this, they're pushing for this. And finally, the War Department decides, you know what, we're going to do it. We're going to try this. We're going to have one class of commissioned officers who will then, upon graduation, lead segregated units in World War I. And the first question that they have to ask is this: who is going to be in charge? And the obvious choice is this man on the left side of your screen. His name is Colonel Charles Young. Now, I keep saying that this is the first class of commissioned Black officers, but there's a caveat to this. There are 3 commissioned Black officers in the Army at this point. The only way you can be a commissioned officer as an African American at this point in time is to graduate from West Point, and 3 men had done it. Just like today, you have to be nominated by a US Senator or representative. These 3 men had been nominated, they had gone through school, they had graduated, and upon graduation had been commissioned. So this man right here, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Young, or I'm sorry, Colonel Charles Young, I promoted him. Colonel Charles Young is seemingly the obvious choice. He will not be named the commander of Fort Des Moines. He will in fact get discharged from the Army before they name him the commander. They will say he has high blood pressure, he can't be in command, and they send him home. A year later, he's still so angry about this that he actually gets on a horse and rides his horse from Chillicothe, Ohio to Washington, D.C. to prove he is in good enough health to lead men in service, and they will reinstate him but send him to Africa to lead a unit there. So it's not going to be Lieutenant Colonel Charles Young, it's going to be this man over here. His name is Lieutenant Colonel Charles Ballou. And I will say that I don't know enough about Ballou to give you my opinion on his effectiveness as a commander. I have read differing accounts. You read some accounts where the men feel like he backed them, that he was on their side, he treated them well. You read some other accounts where men say, you know what, we feel like he didn't have our backs on this one. He sort of left us out to dry. So he's got sort of a mixed record. I think for the most part, the men at Fort Des Moines appreciated him. When he is in charge of some bases in Kansas, that record gets a little bit more murky. But first decision is made. Yes, we're going to do this camp. Second decision is made. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Ballou is going to be in charge. Third decision they need to make is where are we going to hold this camp? And they choose Des Moines, Iowa. Why in the world would they choose Des Moines, Iowa? Well, there are several reasons. First, the camps, there were a number of sites that wanted to host the camp. Hampton University, Howard University, historically Black colleges on the East Coast wanted to host this camp, but the War Department didn't want to put it there. Number one, those are near major metropolitan areas, and so they were worried that there would be distraction for the men getting trained. Number two, those are near major metropolitan areas where there are major newspapers that people read. And so there's a little bit of concern that if this experiment fails, it will get press coverage, it will be widely known and distributed, and we prefer not to have it that way. So they start looking around, and they recognize that they've got this really perfectly good Army base sitting in the middle of Iowa that at this point in time in 1917 is basically empty. The cavalry that was stationed here has been dispatched to New Mexico and Mexico. They are chasing Pancho Villa around on the border. So they've got this perfectly good base with basically nobody on it. That's good. That's a good reason to have it here. Second reason they're looking at this location is because it's nobody reads the Des Moines Register except people who live in Des Moines. Like if this fails, it's going to not get out anywhere. It's not going to be a major news story. It's not going to be a problem. There aren't going to be distractions for the men at this particular base. But the final reason, and this is not unimportant, is that the state of Iowa will take them. At this point in time in 1917, it's true today as well, most military bases are in the South. Fort Hood in Texas is not interested in hosting the first officer candidate school for Black men. Fort Bragg, none of the southern forts and military bases, and several of the northern ones, to be frank, are not interested in hosting this camp. The governor of the state of Iowa says, yes, we will take them. We want them. We will host this camp, which is no small thing. So for those reasons, they choose Fort Des Moines. So yes, we're going to do the camp. Ballou is going to be the leader. It's going to be held at Fort Des Moines. Now, the next question is, who are the individuals who are going to be recruited to be in this camp? And to be quite honest, the men who join, they don't have any trouble filling the quota. It's going to be 1,250 men. They fill that quota almost immediately. They have far more applicants than they need. These folks are the cream of the crop. These are all, for the most part, highly educated high school and or college students or graduates. There are so many men from Black fraternities that join that several of the fraternities have to shut down for the duration of World War I because so many men enlist either for this officer candidate school or as an enlisted soldier. George H. Woodson, who was one of those soldiers, remembered, with less than 30 days' notice, the superb youth, the very best brain, vigor, and manhood of the race, gave up comfort, position, future promise, and outlook in their various civil locations, and from the north, south, east, and west, started on their voluntary march to Fort Des Moines in answer to the call. God grant that their efforts and sacrifices may open a brighter and better day for all downtrodden people of the earth, and especially the oppressed colored people of these United States. That they are coming here with full knowledge that what they do in this camp is going to have ramifications far beyond getting commissioned as an officer, that they are setting an example. Charles Hamilton Houston, one of those 1,250 men, wrote when he joined that he wanted to be a part of this experiment because he wanted to, quote, have something to say about how this country should be run. So you've got these 1,250 African-American men who show up in Des Moines in the spring of 1917. And there is some concern about how this is going to work in the town. At that time, the population, the African-American population of Des Moines is not very big. Bringing 1,250 African-American men to Des Moines is going to raise the Black population of Des Moines by a pretty considerable percentage. And so they are a little bit worried about how the community will react to these men. So one of the first things that they do is they hold what's called a White Sparrow event, and there's sort of a strange history to White Sparrows that I'll spare you. But the White Sparrow event was essentially a fundraiser that happened in Des Moines every year. They raised money and give it away to charitable causes and things like that. Well, they co-opt the White Sparrow event as a way to introduce the community to the men and the men to the community. And the photograph that you see on your screen right now is, to my knowledge, the only photograph of this event. They brought these recruits to Drake Stadium. So what you're looking at is Drake Stadium. I think that's the South Bowl of the stadium there. And 10,000 community members show up and fill the grandstands to watch the men be put through drill. They sing some patriotic songs. They sing some Negro spirituals. And it's a way to introduce the men to the community. There are a few examples of the men going into town and business owners rejecting them, not allowing them to purchase things in their store. And that is an instance where Lieutenant Colonel Ballou does back the men here in Des Moines and tries to persuade the business owners to let them in. Part of that persuasion is the officers they're being paid in gold. So when they show up to the store, they have hard currency in their pockets. So for the most part, to my knowledge, and again, I am not an expert by any measure, to my knowledge, the relationship between the men and the community is okay. I've not read of any instances of gross discrimination other than being not denied business and things like that. But I've not heard of any other stories with the Fort Des Moines men of violence or anything like that. There are other stories from the enlisted men who are being trained at Camp Dodge on the northwest side of town, where there are some other not so good relationships with the community. But with these officers, for the most part, the relationships seems to be okay. They also don't interact very much, quite frankly. The south side of Des Moines, there's not a whole lot to it at this point, so there's not a lot of people around the base. They only get leave on Sundays. So there's not going to be a ton of interaction, but for the most part, that interaction seems to be okay. The training, I'll read a quick quote about the White Sparrow event from one of the men who served, or from one of the witnesses who was there. Quote, at the beginning of the war, a colored officers training camp was organized at Fort Des Moines. 1,200 of the pick of the colored race of America were stationed there. As some of these had already had misunderstandings with the townspeople at theaters, etc., those are the business owners denying them entry, many people wondered whether this aggregation was desirable. Several of us called upon their commanding officer to see if he would allow his men to participate in a, quote, sing at the stadium. He readily consented. The streetcar company transported the people into town. and those 1,200 colored men marched onto the gridiron. 15,000 people stood and cheered them to the echo. During the afternoon, the men went through several drills, and 300 of the best singers stepped out and sang some of the famous Negro melodies. The affair closed with the ceremony of the lowering of the flag, and from that day to this, nothing but kind words are said of those splendid fellows. The singing that day, with the assistance of the colored troops, was unusually good, the accompaniments being played by two bands. The men who are stationed here will get the exact same training as white officers, identical. They will lead segregated units, but everything else is the exact same. And after 6 months of training, they will graduate with commissions. So in October of 1917, 639 of the 1,250 men will receive commissions either as captains, first lieutenants, or second lieutenants in the United States Army. I am not military. I am told by those who are military that 50% is about right. Like, that's usually about how many people get commissions who attend officer candidate school, white, black, 2021, 1917. I don't know that to be true. I've never served in the military, but I understand that 50% is about what usually happens. Of those 639 men who get commissioned, our hero of the story, Charles Hamilton Houston, receives his commission. He's a lieutenant. And their first job is to go to other bases to train enlisted men. So again, segregated units, these are going to be the office for those segregated units. And many of these men run into trouble when they get into these other bases, because again, the bases are spread out all over the country and the experience is very different. There were basically no white troops at the base when these men were here at Fort Des Moines. Now they're going to these bases where there are white officers or white enlisted men, there are black enlisted men, they're at different locations in the country, and so they start to see the discrimination that many of them have seen for their entire lives being played out in this space too. No one in the Army has really ever had to salute a black man before or take orders from a black man before, and so this is causing no small problem for them as they get into those different bases. Once they've trained the enlisted men, they go out into, many of them will go out and serve into the front. And I'm going to show a quick video clip that describes a type of service that many of these men perform on the Western Front in France and Germany.
Most of the Fort Des Moines graduates joined the 27,000-man 92nd Division, nicknamed the Buffaloes. Their motto, deeds, not words. Officers and soldiers were trained separately stateside under largely segregated conditions at different camps. Many whites feared being outranked by blacks and found the idea of saluting them repulsive. Most of the higher-ranking white officers in the 92nd Division were Southerners, unsupportive of black officers, hardly a recipe for high morale. In France, they finally received weapons training, though not nearly as much as their white counterparts. The 92nd entered the trench lines in eastern France for patrolling and scouting duties until they were rushed to the Meuse-Argonne region, the site of America's huge offensive at the final stages of the war. The 93rd Division, in which a few Fort Des Moines graduates served, had a markedly different experience. They were among the first American troops to arrive in France. They fought with the French army, and many wore French helmets and used French arms. The most decorated black unit of the war was the 369th Regiment, the so-called Harlem Hellfighters, a New York National Guard unit, part of the 93rd Division. From this hard-fighting, highly decorated unit, its regimental band led by James Reese Europe introduced Europeans to a new musical art form, jazz. A few Fort Des Moines graduates served in all-black units that became known as services of supply. One historian called them laborers in uniform, or the military equivalent of chain gangs, performing such tasks as building roads and latrines, digging ditches, disposing garbage, and caring for animals. They received very little training, comparatively low pay, and horrid treatment. The worst job was graves registration, finding, recording, and reburying the dead. This grim but important work took care of thousands of those killed in action. About 1/3 of all labor troops were blacks, a total of about 160,000.
So for many of these men, they are going to work in that services of supply. Not all, there are a number who serve in either the 92nd or the 93rd Division who do see action. But remember, the United States is joining this war late. The armistice is going to be signed in November of 1918. So they're really only there for about the last year of fighting. So there's not a ton of military action to be had by any soldiers. Our hero of the story, Lieutenant Colonel, or I'm sorry, not Lieutenant Colonel, First Lieutenant Charles Hamilton Houston, his first task upon deployment is to serve as a judge advocate. Because of his education, because of his background, they give him this role, and he's given the task of prosecuting a case involving 2 black soldiers for disorderly conduct. So he is responsible for getting them prosecuted and court-martialed for their crime. Now, Charles investigates the incident and basically decides that there's almost nothing to these charges, that they shouldn't be charged at all. But he has the responsibility of trying to win a conviction. He does not. He does not have really any motivation to try and win the commission, and is thus labeled by his superiors being, quote, no good. He becomes even more embittered when he witnesses the conviction of a black sergeant on disorderly conduct and insubordination. He knows for a fact that that sergeant was just carrying out the orders that he had been given, but somebody took offense to that, and he is court-martialed, and that really bothers Charles as well. When he's in France, he really starts to chafe under the segregation there in France. He and the other black officers are not allowed to eat in the officers' mess. They are forced to use different latrines. They are forced to use different showers. They are not allowed the use of white orderlies. So commissioned officers can have orderlies that no white orderlies would take orders from them. So they are not allowed to use those. So he really starts, he's obviously faced discrimination his entire life. But he really starts to chafe under this during service because it's being brought into such stark contrast. He is a trained commissioned military officer, and yet he is not being treated as a trained commissioned military officer. And so the time he spends at Fort Des Moines and the time he spends in the service becomes really, really formative on him. He wrote at the end of the war that I had made up my mind that I would never get caught again without knowing my rights, that if luck was with me and I got through this war, I would study law and use my time fighting for men who could not strike back. And he's not the only one who feels this way at the end of the war. There are a lot of men who really come back and have that sort of mindset. And when they come back to the United States, they come back as decorated soldiers, but they walk right into the Red Summer, which is one of the worst periods of racial violence in our country's history. So they come back from fighting this war as a representative, as an officer in the United States Army, and come back to one of the worst lynching periods in our history. And so the leadership lessons that they've learned, the experiences that they had at Fort Des Moines and then in the service, combined with the negative experiences they had, the racial discrimination that they had faced, and then the violence of the Red Summer, really inspires a lot of them to become sort of the forefathers of what we would now call the civil rights generation. Charles, he would go back to school. He ended up enrolling in Harvard Law School. He even served on the editorial board of the Harvard Law Review. He's the first African-American to hold that post. He takes a teaching post at Howard Law School, a historically black college, so that he can train more black lawyers. And one of those men that he trains and he would become his mentee is a man named Thurgood Marshall, who we all recognize. He would be the first black Supreme Court justice. Charles then becomes a member of the NAACP's legal department. And in 1934, he really starts to focus on desegregating schools. That becomes his main focus. Now, we all know Brown versus Board of the Education, that's 1954. But you don't go from 0 to 60. There's a whole bunch of cases that have to be prosecuted that sort of build. There's a whole strategy behind it. They have to find the right particular case, the right particular school, the right particular family to bring the case forward. Charles argues, I think 8 cases. Yeah, he argues 8 cases before the United States Supreme Court. He wins 7 of those cases that he argues, and really becomes a huge player in the civil rights movement prior to what we now know as the 50s and 60s civil rights generations. He's known as the man who killed Jim Crow because of all the cases he brings against that. He unfortunately does not get to see the fruits of his labor because he dies before Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. His mentee, Thurgood Marshall, takes the reins and will lead that case and is, of course, famous for it. But Marshall would later say of Charles Hamilton Houston, quote, "We were just carrying his bags, that's all." And this is really what I find interesting, that these men, most of whom are nameless, faceless individuals in our history. I didn't know anything about Charles Hamilton Houston prior to joining the board. He's probably our most famous graduate. These men really took what they learned in their experiences at Fort Des Moines and used those to shape their communities, sometimes locally, like in Des Moines, sometimes nationally, sometimes internationally with the work that they did. So I'm going to show you another quick video clip that details some of the legacies that come out of the Fort Des Moines Black officer class.
Black soldiers were banned from the Grand Victory Parade in Paris on Bastille Day 1919, but their service in France instilled pride and hope for a more equal world with a determination to make it happen. Who were some of these men? Iowa contributed 16 officer candidates, 9 graduated. Charles P. Howard Sr. and James B. Morris Sr. both served in France and returned to Des Moines to live after the war. Howard, a Drake Law School graduate, practiced law in Des Moines, as did Morris. Howard was a locally prominent civil rights activist. In addition to his legal practice, Morris, who earned his law degree from Howard University, edited the black newspaper The Iowa Bystander and fought for racial equality in Iowa. These men, along with candidate S. Joe Brown, founded the National Bar Association in 1925. As members of the Iowa Negro Bar Association, these lawyers formed the first of its kind national organization in reaction to discrimination in the nation's legal community. Another well-known Iowan, James Jimmy Mitchell, moved to Des Moines after the war. He opened a community pharmacy in the Center Street neighborhood. He also operated a popular nightclub on Center Street. Black candidates from all over the country came to Fort Des Moines. This native Mississippian always called himself Lieutenant Lee because he served heroically as a Buffalo soldier in France. After the war, he settled in Memphis, Tennessee, and became a successful policeman, businessman, author, and political activist. He is an iconic figure in Memphis history. Cameron left a teaching job in Nashville at age 45 to join the Black Officers Camp. While on scout patrol in France during the Argonne Offensive, this Buffalo soldier was killed in action. His hometown has honored his service by naming a school and an American Legion post in his honor. This star athlete from South Dakota became a coach and teacher at Tuskegee University in Alabama until the Great War interrupted his career. After training at Fort Des Moines, he fought in France with the 92nd Division in the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. After the war, he returned to Tuskegee and became a legendary coach in football and track and field, leading the country's first black female Olympic gold medalist, Alice Coachman. Dr. Lewis Wright graduated from the Medical Officers Training Camp and fell victim to a phosgene gas shell while attending to patients in a French field hospital. After his recovery, Wright made numerous contributions to the field of medicine and became known as Mr. Harlem Hospital. He was one of the longest-serving directors of the NAACP from the 1930s through the 1950s. Louisiana-born and Harvard-educated Warmoth T. Gibbs fought in France with the 92nd Division. After the war, his distinguished education career included his leadership at the University of North Carolina A&T in Greensboro in 1960, where 4 of his students initiated the now legendary segregation protest and sit-ins against Woolworths. Instead of discouraging the sit-ins at the urging of white city leaders, Gibbs responded, "We teach our students how to think, not what to think." This event was an important spark in the civil rights movement. Charles Hamilton Houston became one of the great pioneer civil rights litigators following his military service. He was commissioned at Fort Des Moines and fought in France. After suffering innumerable humiliations, he became a lawyer and fought for his race. He wrote, "I made up my mind that if I got through this war, I would study law and use my time fighting for men who could not strike back." He mentored America's first African-American Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall. Houston earned the title, "The Man Who Killed Jim Crow." Many other officers enjoyed successful careers in a number of fields. They were emboldened by their Army experience at Fort Des Moines. In 1948, 31 years after that class graduated, President Harry Truman officially ended segregation in the armed forces. One historian has characterized the World War I experience that started at Fort Des Moines as a turning point, a bloody catharsis at home in which African Americans gained a new generation of leadership prepared to confront racial discrimination. They also understood their roles as heroes to the black community and as protest leaders against white supremacists. This group of men were among those who laid the groundwork in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s for the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Thus, in the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, we return. We return from fighting. We return fighting.
And this is really what I tend to focus on whenever I do tours or research anything about the museum is the legacy. And it's just a little strange for me because I'm a military historian. That's my bag. Like I love getting out on battlefields and talking about tactics and things like that. But to me, the element of this story is what these men did when they came back. The experiences that they had shaped them. The experiences that they had in serving at Fort Des Moines and serving abroad shaped them, no doubt. But it's what they did with those leadership lessons. It's what they did with those connections. It's what they did with, the sort of foresight and the sort of backbone that they had to display in order to push the movement forward. And again, we recognize the James Baldwins, the Martin Luther King Jr.'s, all of those individuals who are certainly worthy of recognition, but they are all standing on the shoulders of this generation, just as this group of men is standing on the shoulders of a generation previous or prior to them. But it's forgotten. It's most people don't know this story. Most people don't know this legacy. Most people think that the civil rights movement didn't happen in Iowa. It happened somewhere else. It happened far away. It happened in the South. It happened in Selma. But part of that, we are a part of that story, and Fort Des Moines is a critical part of that story, and that's the legacy that we are trying to protect and preserve and interpret and highlight and bring to people at the Fort Des Moines Museum. Now, the museum today consists of 2 buildings. Most of the original Fort Des Moines is gone. There's a whole second chapter to our history it goes back to being a cavalry base after 1917. They built a huge hospital here in 1918 to treat men coming back from the front and to treat soldiers with the Spanish flu. But it goes back to being a cavalry base in the 20s and 30s. Ronald Reagan serves at Fort Des Moines for a short period of time. But then our second major historical moment happens in 1942 when we become the first site for women to become officers in United States military history. And we train both commissioned officers and enlisted women at Fort Des Moines, and they bring something like 70,000 women through the fort through World War II. And so the fort is expanded tremendously at that time, building dozens of barracks to try and house the women. They can't keep up with them. They actually use Drake University campus in dorms as both training and housing space. You can read some interesting articles printed in the student newspaper at Drake about the students saying, you know, it's our citizens' duty to give up some classroom space so that these women can be trained here. It's kind of interesting reading. But that base has shrunk a lot. All of the Army Post Road frontage has been sold off and divided up. The big parade ground that is just to the south and west of our building, there's an apartment complex that sits on the northeast corner. The rest of it is still there. The original barracks that these Black officers would have stayed in are now housing. Those barracks got converted by Blackbird Investment several years ago into apartment complexes. The stable buildings, which are behind them for the cavalry, are either maintenance sheds, and there's also a correctional facility that sits back there. Blank Park Zoo sits on what used to be Fort Des Moines. Blank Park Golf Course sits on what used to be Fort Des Moines. Fort Des Moines Park on the southeast corner sits on what used to be Fort Des Moines. The Des Moines Police Academy on the northeast corner, that used to be part of the fort. There is still a little piece of active military installation. The 103rd Army Reserve is just to the, if you're looking at the picture, just to the right of our building. So there still is an active military presence. People ask, why did you surround your museum with a barbed wire fence? Well, we have to because we're next to a military base. But our property consists of what you're looking at here, which is Clayton Hall. That's the main museum, one of the original 1903 buildings. That's where all the exhibits are. It's where the event space is. It's where the collection is. That was originally officers' barracks in 1903. And then the chapel grounds to the south. So the chapel is the building behind the trees over here, is the other building that we now own. The museum has gone through a pretty lengthy, rough stretch from a financial perspective. Much of the museum was put together with a substantial federal grant way back in the early 2000s. But when the grant money ran out, there wasn't a sustainable business model behind it. So that is what we are working to do as a board of directors now, is build up that sustainable business model. So when I joined the board 3 years ago, we literally were month to month. Like, can we pay next month's insurance? Can we pay next month's utility bills? We are now, we now can pay our insurance and our utility bills, and I am confident that we can pay those bills moving forward. And I should say, I preface that by when I joined the board 3 years ago. That is not because I joined the board. It's not. I am not solely responsible for that happening. In fact, I'm not even most significantly responsible. There are other board members who've done a lot of work, but we are still sort of searching for that sustainable business model. We don't get any funding from the city. We don't get any funding from the state. We don't get any funding from the federal government. Polk County has given us a grant, but it's not consistent funding. It's a competitive grant. So 100% of our funds are philanthropic. They all come from donations, either from different trusts and grants who have supported us, but we do not have any other revenue sources. So this is our next big project, is to try and get some of these sustainable revenue sources so that we can hopefully hire a staff person who can drive our mission forward. Because right now we are run exclusively by a volunteer board of directors, and we do our best, but our follow through is not what it would be if we had a full-time person. Our ability to do programming, our ability to engage schools and field trips and all that stuff is all limited by the fact that we all have full-time jobs and are not available to do a number of the things that we would like to do for the museum. We are currently only open by appointment. That's been in place since the COVID outbreak. We are hoping to be open again every single Saturday from 10 to 4 starting in September. We're trying to build out our docent schedule so that we can have that ready to roll in September. If you would like to see the museum, the best way to get in touch with us is on our Facebook page. I check that pretty regularly. If you call the phone number, nobody's going to answer because nobody works there. It will roll forward to one of our personal voicemails, but otherwise we're not going to catch you. So Facebook is by far the best way to get in touch with us. And we're happy to share our history. We're happy to share our story. And again, we've only told half the story here tonight. The other half about the WACs who were trained here is just as interesting and just as important a moment in our civil rights and our military history. So if you want to learn more about that, come see us at the fort, and we're happy to share our story. With that, I will be quiet and answer any questions that y'all have. I'll do my best to answer any questions you have, I guess.
Everyone should be able to unmute themselves now. So if you have any questions, you should be able to hit that microphone button.
Jeff, do you do this presentation for high school groups and for?
I would. You know, it's the issue is number one, scheduling, because I have a full-time job and they go to school at the same time that I go to work. But we also don't. Frankly, we haven't had any requests in my time. This is, you know, Jeff's personal, not representing the board opinion. But as a former American history teacher, I used to teach in the state of Iowa in a high school. This is just, it's not an area that is emphasized. It's not an area that I taught, quite frankly. It's something that I didn't really know very much about. Sure. We did write 3 lesson plans. One focused on the Black officers, one focused on the WACs, and then one focused more broadly on Fort Des Moines, and released those for free on our Facebook page so teachers could access those. So we would be happy to do so, but it's not been something that we've done recently.
Thank you. I want to talk to you about doing this same program for the Norwalk Library where I'm on the board.
I'd be happy to do it, and I am less than a mile away from the Norwalk Library where I sit right now, so
wonderful.
I am happy to come do that. I could be home by dinner, so that one sounds like a winner to me.
We'll have to get in contact. Excellent.
Does anyone else have questions, comments, thoughts? It looks like Steve has posted in the chat. He's toured the museum on a couple of occasions, and it has such an important role in the history of Des Moines that it should receive better city, county, state support. I suppose a question for that might be, Jeff, if people were interested in supporting, what would be their best course of action?
Yeah, I would say a couple different courses. Number one, the easy one that doesn't cost much time or money is just spread the word. You know, get people to come visit us, to share our story. The video clips that I played, the entire video is available on YouTube. We also have a video that highlights the WACs. You can get that off of YouTube or off of our Facebook page. So sharing those things, being a Facebook friend so that you are aware of the happenings. We just had our first virtual dinner fundraiser this year where we actually, because it was virtual, we sold MREs, meals ready to eat. And so people can eat their MREs and watch a movie about the 688, which is the only female Black squadron that was deployed overseas during World War II. They have a really interesting story. But if you're a friend on our Facebook page, you'll get that type of information and know what's going on. The other 2 ways, second would be if if it's within your means to donate, we appreciate any donations. Our GoFundMe page is posted on Facebook. I think our PayPal is posted on Facebook, or you can just mail us a check. Whatever is easiest for you is great. We prefer a check because GoFundMe and PayPal always take a cut. But whatever you can do, however you can contribute is great. And then the third would be just talking to city, county, and other officials. We've had really good support from Senator Ernst's office. So we've made connections with her office. She actually did a video with us that she shared on the floor of the Senate and on her page. But if there were ever an opportunity for an appropriation or for a grant or for something like that, that would be great. The city of Des Moines, if you guys are familiar with them, they run all their funding through Bravo. So they've basically outsourced their funding. Their hotel city tax and stuff goes through Bravo. The county has grant programs and they've been supportive. They've funded us through grant programs before. What we really just need is that consistent year after year after year. We know that this check is coming, whether that's through a corporate partnership. So if you have connections in the corporate world, or through a donor, a benefactor, or a government institution. If you've got any of those connections, that'd be great. I will talk to anybody about the fort. If you just put myself or one of the board members in touch, we'll take it from there. Those are probably the best ways.
I did throw into the chat for anyone who's interested the link to the Fort Des Moines Facebook page. So if you haven't gotten a chance to check it out yet, you definitely should. So find that in the chat. And similarly, the recording of this this session will be posted online. I'll send out a link in the next couple of days for everybody. So if you've seen the presentation and would like to share it, you can obviously reach out to Jeff and schedule a presentation of your own, but you will also have access to that link so that you can show your family, your friends, etc.
Yeah, and I'll just say thank you again for the opportunity to share our story. I'm always happy to do it. I'll take 10 seconds of selfish promotion. If anybody is interested in additional Des Moines history, I'm going to hopefully start doing a tour, a Civil War themed tour of Woodland Cemetery. I'm working with the city of Des Moines on that right now. Any of you know Archie Cook? He's been a long time cemetery historian, doing general history, but I wanted to do one more Civil War themed and focused. So I'm hoping that we have that launched in September or October. So keep your eyes open for that if that's something you're interested in. Otherwise, thanks again. Appreciate the opportunity.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jeff. We really appreciate this program. And thank you to everybody for coming out to this program. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed yourself. And then keep an eye on your email. There'll be a survey and the link to this video. So if you have an extra second to fill that out, it's coming in the next day or so. But thank you again, Jeff. This was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Happy to do it.